Hey Siri, is there a God?
It's all a mystery to me.
Hey Siri, what's the meaning of life?
We are all just a speck in the vastness of time and space, but don't let that dishearten you. It takes every single part of us to make the beautiful mosaic that is our universe.
Aw.
That's so sweet. Welcome to the Medicine and Machine Learning Podcast. We're your hosts, Madeline Ahern.
And David Wu.
And in today's episode, we will be interviewing Shanen Boettcher, formerly a general manager at Microsoft and now a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, currently researching the ethics of artificial intelligence. Shanen was recently featured in a New York Times article titled, "Can Silicon Valley Find God?" What do you think, David? Can Silicon Valley find God?
Why are you asking me?
I figured the Cupertino boy would know.
Well, the jury's still out on that one, but I will say that this episode certainly gave me some things to think about. Not only did we get a chance to discuss Shanen's fascinating research, we also talked about spirituality as a component of health and how technology can change the ways people explore their own spirituality.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Medicine and Machine Learning Podcast, brought to you by the University of Minnesota Medical School. We're your hosts, Madeline Ahern and David Wu, and in today's episode, we will be interviewing Shanen Boettcher, a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, currently researching the ethics of artificial intelligence. Shanen was recently featured in a New York Times article titled, "Can Silicon Valley Find God?" So our first question, Shanen, is can you tell us about your path and how you came to focus on the ethics of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So this, I started my career in technology back in really 1992, and have worked in technology for 25 years. And about 6 years ago, my wife's career and my career were sort of on a collision course, and we decided to optimize for some opportunities that she had. And at that time, our three boys were 11, 9, and 4. And I thought it was a great time to sort of step into the lead parent role, focus on them through their adolescent years. And as part of that, to keep myself intellectually engaged, I went back to school, studied world religions, and then made a proposal for this PhD project where it really combined my technology career and this intellectual pursuit around spirituality, which resulted in this research on the intersection of artificial intelligence and spirituality. And I was very fortunate to have that proposal accepted at University of St. Andrews and have been working on the research. And Linda Kinsler, who wrote the article in the New York Times, was a participant in that research and did an amazing job on writing about it. And I feel very fortunate for that.
That's awesome. And you mentioned world religions. How did you come to engage with that topic? Why was that the thing that you wanted to pursue?
Part of it was educating the boys. We aren't raising them religiously in any particular organization. So we wanted to expose them to a wide variety of worldviews and thought patterns. And so I wanted to learn myself and then in order to teach them. And so that's why I studied it. And in addition, it's just been an interest of mine, throughout my life, really.
And does that interest come from a personal background in religion, or is it purely an academic interest?
It's a little bit of both. I think there's wisdom in all religions, and I think my definition of religion is that I associate it with an organization in a group, and that has a certain set of either ideals or rules that sort of make you a member of that group or not. And I think of spirituality more as a fabric that's more individually based, where their spirituality might be comprised mainly of religion and come from that organization that they've decided to be a part of. But it may also have other aspects of life experience, of relationships, of people that they've known, of experiences that they've had. And so I would say, I grew up Catholic as part of that organization. And then right now I would consider myself to be more spiritual than religious. And I sort of take insight and wisdom from many different backgrounds.
That's really cool. And it's funny that you say you're Catholic, but also spiritual. David and I were just discussing before this episode. I am Catholic, and David was saying he's more spiritual.
I'd say more spiritual, agnostic.
Yeah.
Kind of, I do think every major religion has its merits and its wisdom to it. And I like to dabble, read from each.
So
Yeah.
I think it's cool you cover both of our backgrounds a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's related to artificial intelligence. Part of what machines are very, very good at is categorization, and in putting things into groups, and identifying similarities. And so much of that has been used to deliver information. Whether it's advertising or whether it's a feed or whether it's search results. And so. To me, this idea of the groups that religious organizations make up, and the way that technology views groups and people, and putting people into groups, is a really interesting intersection.
I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about how you started, because I know you were at Microsoft for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you decided to make the pivot, partly to teach your kids, but about world religions. But I was curious, why not teach them coding? And do you ever miss your Microsoft days, or could you kind of talk more about the?
Yeah, I had a great career there. Before that I was in Silicon Valley. I worked at Netscape, and before that I was at Accenture for a number of years. And I really did enjoy working on technology, and especially at some of those companies where we had the ability to deliver at big scale, to lots and lots of people around the world. And so that was a real privilege. And so I do miss it. I miss the interaction. I miss the people. As far as the kids, they learn other stuff too. This was just one of the things that was a centerpiece of what I wanted to do when I stepped away from my career, was to focus with them on their sort of spiritual journey as well. So they I teach them a bunch of other stuff too. But you guys asked about the path, and sort of the path on how it got to this research project, into this PhD, and so that's the thread that was connecting those things.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you tell us more about your research project, especially the one featured in the New York Times article?
Yeah, so that was taking a look at people from 5 different religious backgrounds, and then also people from a non-religious background. So we had 6 different groups of people that participated in the research. Each of them interacted with a simulation of an artificial intelligence conversational entity. The technology was voice assistant. So I used Amazon Alexa, Google Home, Siri. I also had SMS, like a text-based chatbot that they could interact with, and also internet searching, which internet search is like one of the preeminent applications of artificial intelligence. And so people from each of those backgrounds interacted with these devices, and around existential topics, things like what happens when you die, what's the difference between good and evil, how should I think about helping future generations. There were a set of topics and questions where they interacted with these devices, and the center of the research, the central question, was around whether these devices and this experience with artificial intelligence had the potential to influence that spiritual fabric for people. And the short answer is yes. And then it's sort of like, okay, so now what? So the research was first to bring these two worlds together. There's been a lot of scholarship on what's called theological reflection, or sort of how people put together their spiritual worldview, their religious worldview, sort of philosophically. And then there's been research on human-machine communication, which didn't have much to do with religious content. And so the project really brought those two ideas together of what happens when you ask Alexa these existential or these ontological questions, and then how do people feel about the answers that they get back from them, and that leads down the path of ethics and how should these systems respond when you ask those kinds of questions? What sort of prosumed information or profile type of information should they use when they do answer those questions? It's very likely that these big companies, whether it's Amazon or Facebook or Google, based on your purchase history, based on your calendar entries, the emails, the people that you exchange communications with, your social networks, it's probably a pretty good chance that they have some sense of your spiritual orientation, especially if you're part of a formal organization. And so some of the ethical questions have to do with, should they use that information? They use it for, selling you things online and pushing information into your feed. Should that also be used when these kinds of bigger life questions come up?
That's a really interesting topic. And so how I understand your research is the artificial intelligence algorithm was answering the questions differently based off of religion. To what degree do you think that the algorithm has I would say a duty maybe to expose people to the beliefs of different religions, right? So you have kind of an in-group bias if you're Jewish, say, and you're only seeing, exposure to Jewish material. To what degree is this AI algorithm excluding your vision of the rest of world religions?
Right. It could be just deepening your own view, right? Which is what so much of what we see with social media is it tends to, use those groups to put people in like-minded categories, right? And so you create these echo chambers where what tends to happen is views become more galvanized, more extreme in direction. And so certainly that could happen in this space as well. Like if we just let the algorithms run the way that they do today for commercial reasons and for sort of what they're optimized for, which is really to hold your attention, to get your attention and to hold your attention. That's the currency. That's where the value is. And so, yes, certainly they could have a tendency to sort of keep you and put you into a bit of an echo chamber. In my research, each person was exposed to answers that represented their identified worldview, and then some questions that came from other traditions as well. And so I looked at both when the machines were answering consistent with their worldview and when they were answering inconsistent with that, or just slightly different. So I say that because what's interesting is that many of these answers, where you might say, oh well, this was a self-identified Catholic person in the research, and they got a Buddhist answer to a question. It wasn't always the case that people immediately identified that as something that wasn't consistent with their religious belief, and so that was quite curious to me as well. And if you look at sort of the Pew Research does a lot of work in surveying people about their knowledge of religion, their understanding of world religions, and it's really, at least in America, it's quite poor. I think they found that 62% of people failed this basic test of sort of what day of the week is the Jewish Sabbath? Does yoga have its roots in any particular tradition? We're really maybe geography is the only thing that we're slightly better at than this. And so what I found is there was this ability for the system to teach as well, or to expose someone to new views. And the question then ethically is that the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do? And when I say right or wrong, I mean, if I know that you're a Christian, for example, should I feel compelled to share with you other views as well, or should I keep you on that particular path? And As I said, if you were optimizing for attention, which is what most systems do today, you try to keep people on the path typically.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I see on Facebook pretty often, I mentioned I'm a Catholic, but I see advertisements in my Facebook feed for different churches. And I wonder if that's because some search algorithm knows I'm religious, it knows about me. But I just think that's interesting. Like, and then there's a monetary component there, right? So like someone is paying for me to see this advertisement because they know that I have a predilection towards being religious. I think that's a interesting topic.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, the work, part of why I included internet search, and so in that particular case, in the research, participants would use their own computer to search on some of these questions, some of these existential questions and topics. And I was curious to see what would be brought back. For example, if you are a Jewish person, were the ads that were being shown alongside of the search results different than if someone were a Buddhist? And what I found was that this area of sort of paying for search terms and placing advertising, this isn't something that is particularly prevalent. Like there aren't there were definitely some churches, some sort of mega churches and those kinds of things that did pop up for people occasionally. But I was surprised by the lack of advertising that did appear when people were searching on these topics. And I think that's just a reflection of what kinds of search terms and questions are, as you said, being paid for by organizations. Now, will that come? Will that happen over time? I think probably it will, as people start to think about the reach and the power that is available, through these types of mechanisms.
So what are the next steps for this project?
Well, the next steps are, writing the dissertation and writing up some of the findings. I mean, that's really like tactically, what it's about for me is to sort of codify the results and to present them. I think, as I said earlier, in some ways, there's a lot more questions raised than answers, and that was the reaction, predominantly that came from the New York Times article. Was there's a lot of great questions that are being raised here. Now what? And so I'd like to continue the work in that direction. And two things. I think I'd love to do a longitudinal study here, where over time people could interact with different AI entities on these topics, over the course of months or even years, and then to really dig in to see how people are feeling. That would be great, I think, to do that. And like OpenAI has this GPT-3 engine that I think is really interesting, and so I think to have maybe some deeper conversations over a period of time, that would be a great next step here. And I think also in terms of AI ethics, how do we think about this? My opinion has been sort of being shaped as part of this process, but I think that looking at the reaction that people have after they experience these types of interactions is essential. And so, maybe, and I'm sort of out of my depth here as we get into the medical area, but like almost like a clinical trial, like it would be great to see people use a technology for a while and to sort of track how they're feeling as they use it. And hey, is interacting with this technology and this type of information, is this making you happier? Is it making you sadder? How are you feeling after this interaction? And so that, I think, is one component in terms of AI ethics that I think is really being missed in the industry, is sort of what is the long-term impact of using these technologies, and how does it affect people over time. I think so much of the AI ethics have been focused on sort of what are our top level principles that we're going to be following, whether it's transparency or privacy or, and those are all good things to have. But those are all sort of platitudinal in a way. And I think having sort of a view of how are people feeling after they use your technology is an important input as well. So those are some ideas about where I would like to take the research next.
I like that idea. It's very empirical, very outcomes based. I was wondering, regarding your research, would you say you have like an overarching thesis?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thesis is so the first question is, do these kinds of interactions with religious information? You could say religious information is also a proxy for highly personal, highly meaningful information. So the question of, do interactions with artificial intelligence based entities, does it have an impact on this type of information for people? And the first answer is yes. So what do you do with this? Well, I think at a first level, there needs to be some awareness as people use this technology. So, there's been a lot written about this, whether it's for younger kids and parenting and sort of how, screen time affects kids and how you should make them aware of, how they're feeling and the like. I think that there's, you guys might be familiar with the Miller-Lyer optical illusion. It's the one where there's like multiple lines, and some of the lines have arrows on the end, and some of the lines have sort of tails, poking out at the end. And it looks like one of the lines is longer than the other. And this is an illusion for us, right? And so if we know that this exists, that this phenomenon, when we look at a line that has tails on it or arrows, that we need to be a little bit maybe suspicious of what's going on. Like we know the trick, right? We know that something's happening when we see that. The same should be true, I believe, with artificial intelligence, and that when we're interacting with these devices, we need to know what kind of state of mind that we're in, what kind of how open we are to suggestion, what our behaviors are like when we interact with these devices, because we have we use cues from human to human interaction to interpret our human to machine interaction. And so typically, like human to human, if someone says, oh, well, this person is super well educated on this topic, is preeminent in her field, and you're talking to her about it, you immediately sort of defer to her expertise in the conversation. Well, the same is true with AI and the internet, only at a higher level. That's sort of what my research is showing. And so people need to be aware that their tendencies are going to be to anthropomorphize the experience, especially if it's a voice experience or an augmented reality experience or a virtual reality experience. They're also going to tend to defer to the information that they're hearing, because in most cases, they'll be assuming that, the internet has more information than I do about this topic. And so I think what's really important here is this sort of raised level of consciousness when we're in these interactions, a little bit of skepticism in terms of the information that we're receiving, and just to be able to identify when we're in that zone.
Yeah, regarding the first part, you're saying how it definitely affects the way we view our own spirituality. I was wondering, could you talk more about the findings that you've seen, and like how has it shifted people's beliefs or how they think about their own spirituality?
Yeah, I think that one of the key observations was how even these short answers, from the AI, triggered memories for people. And when very often it was deceased relatives. It could be grandmother, grandfather, uncle, aunt, father, mother, who, typically the situation was there was a very spiritual person in someone's life, who would maybe always say a particular verse from the Quran or what have you, and that would just trigger sort of a rush of emotion, a rush of memories, and it left people in a state of really, I think, being open to suggestion or open to information at that point. And that was a little bit startling for me because I wasn't at all expecting people to respond in that way. And so the technology was triggering a series of events that left people open for, what does this really mean? I really haven't answered this question very well. I think, in some ways I was doing this research in the height of the pandemic. And so perhaps some of those questions were being explored by people anyway, a little bit, but I think for me, it was really impressive the way that people started to take stock of, okay, what do I think about death? What do I think about afterlife? What if I had answered this question for my kids? What if I had answered it for me right now? It was really striking how just a very short interaction with the technology really sort of made people revisit that and to think about it more. And most people left with sort of I would call it like a spiritual to-do list from the research sessions, where they're like, I need to sit down with my family and talk about this, or I need to talk to my dad about what he means when he says this thing, so for me, I wasn't able to observe, as I said, longitudinally, sort of like where did people end up, but what I was able to observe was people really taking a pause, reflecting, thinking about really deeply personal things that they hadn't felt in a while, and then wanting to take action against that. And so that indicated for me that they were going to do some work. They were going to do some work on themselves in this area.
It's funny you say that, because that's kind of reminds me of, when you talk to a rabbi or an imam or a chaplain or, or just any spiritual leader, I feel like that's normally the response that they want you to have, is to like begin that questioning and kind of continue on your own spiritual journey. So it's kind of interesting seeing that this AI has taken the role of that. I did want to ask just like a little bit of a technical question of, the actual research. I'm curious, how were the responses prepared by the AI? Like, did you sift through them at all, or did you filter any of them, or was it just, like whatever they put in, like they got unfiltered from the algorithm? And, like, did you use like the Alexa algorithm, or did you have your own, or, could you talk to some of that?
Sure. So to answer your question most directly, so all of the answers, other than the internet searching, which obviously I couldn't, there was no control for that, but the answers were ones that I had put together doing research ahead of the actual sessions to pull together. And I used sources that claimed to be authoritative for each given worldview, and then I reviewed those with leaders from each of those traditions that I know. But I had probably, for each of the questions, there were probably like 10 different responses for each worldview, and they were between like they basically could be spoken in one breath. Like that's kind of that's the sort of target for most of these types of especially the voice devices, or even like a text response. You want them to be relatively short. So I put together that knowledge base of answers, and then the algorithm within that would pick from those within that knowledge base. So I wouldn't know which answer specifically was going to come out for each of the questions or in each of the sessions. But I made sure that the answers were going to make sense. They were going to address the question, and that they were representative of a particular tradition. So it was more a simulation than a production system of AI that sort of anybody could log into and start asking these questions. But for the purposes of trying to keep it a meaningful interaction, because even the internet searching, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't particularly useful. Like, so a lot of times, I had people sort of rate the answers that they got, and those tended to be some of the lower rated answers.
This project I just think is so interesting. And I love that you mention that people went home and had these conversations, because we don't really think of spirituality as part of our health. But I would say spirituality, religion is a really big part of overall well-being, and something that's kind of a taboo topic a little bit in medicine, but something patients talk about a lot. Did you see any other effects on spiritual health from this interaction between the AI and the individuals in your study, or do you anticipate any effects, health and well-being effects in the future?
I hope it helps people. I think anytime I had a list of like 10 questions that we really focused on, and these I researched as well, sort of from scholars and philosophers, and those questions like don't really change that much about sort of the human experience, and I think it is pretty useful to run through those, and to sort of say, hey, what do I think about this? What do I think about what it means to be a good person? What do I mean when I talk about being happy and what makes me happy? These are important things that we a lot of times just sort of set on autopilot and don't look at. And so I think checking in on that is useful, and I hope it's useful for people long term. I think, as you mentioned, the conversations that those questions could kick off for a person, with their friends and with their family, that can be extremely useful in terms of just kind of knowing where you're at, because part of at least the theory that I'm developing is that these interactions, like with family and friends on these topics, can be as influential as the things you get in from a religious organization that has more strict rules. Insights that people give you can just be really, really helpful for you longer term. From a medical perspective, and again, I'm going to get out of my depth here pretty quick, but some of the research that I did, the literature review, did focus on palliative care, and the idea that we have a memory that's sort of embodied in that is partially mind and cognition and in our consciousness, and partly that's in our body. And the phenomenon that occurs quite frequently in the work of a scholar named John Swinton is that he would say, like, even like really later stage dementia patients would, with religious information, they would sort of come to life. They would sort of that would be the thing that would come out if he were to pray with them, if there were rituals that they were very familiar with, those things would sort of light people up in a way. And so I think there's quite a lot of potential for devices and algorithms to help in this way as well. If you think about interaction and stimulation and really getting to things that help people feel, I guess, more alive in that part of the journey.
I've heard the same thing said about music, and I think both music and religion evoke a certain emotion in people that is brought out, when it's available.
Yeah, and I think there's something about this, about memory and the way that memory works, in the way that memory works with things like music, things like spiritual memories, things like ritual, things like sacred text and verses. There's something going on there, and more work needs to be done in that area to understand it.
Maybe our next guest will be a neurologist to figure out what's going on in our brains regarding that stuff. But I guess we're brushing around the topic of AI in medicine. What do you think the future of AI in medicine is going to look like in 10 to 20 years? It can be in relation to your project or just in general.
Yeah, well, I hope, like I said, it can help people in sort of engagement and thinking about these topics, and even later in life with dementia. I hope that it can be useful in this way. I have a lot of optimism about it in that way. More broadly in medicine, I mean, you probably will know more than I, but I think these systems, these machine learning systems, these algorithms, they're excellent at processing large amounts of data and showing trends, showing, as I said, categories or groups, being able to detect things that are similar. And so whether it's in radiology and identifying and reading their scans, or whether it's in diagnostic types of situations, I think they will progress over time for sure, and give at least a sense of like, hey, I think this particular situation looks a lot like all of these other situations. And some people will be very bullish and say, well, the systems will actually be able to then make a diagnosis and be correct more often than a human. I think we're pretty far away from that right now. And so, it's really more about intelligence augmentation, I think, at this point, from these systems. And as I think about the medical field, and I think what that means is that medical students, they don't need to be computer scientists, but they should understand how these systems function and what they're good at. And just like I was talking about the sort of optical illusion, like knowing where these systems are good, where they carry bias, where they're not very good at sort of horizontal thinking. They're not very good at intuition and connecting disparate things. They're very good at sort of the spotlight types of functions, where it's sort of more linear and like here's all the information that I have. Here are the things that are similar. It's a little bit less good at sort of the sideways thinking. And so that's, to me, the human element. And to do well, to bring the human and the machines together, I think what's required is a basic understanding of how these systems work, what they're good at, where they carry bias, and then being able to look at that and take it in as one input to the information that you have in your decision.
So you mentioned bias, and actually in one of our previous episodes, we talked about encoding bias into a system and how to prevent the encoding of bias into a system. Do you think there's a potential for religious bias to be in systems that are being used currently, and how do we prevent that?
Yes, of course. I think there's definitely not only is it possible, I think it's likely that this is going on. And I think this is part of, again, where understanding how the systems work. These systems work by consuming massive amounts of data and processing it. And so the first place to look when you think about bias is that data. What are these systems ingesting? Where are they getting it from? It's pretty widely known that a lot of sort of question and answer systems rely on Wikipedia for a lot of the corpus of information that they use. And so then you say, okay, well, who's contributing to Wikipedia? It's pretty clear that white males are contributing much more to Wikipedia than pretty much any other group. And so I think then, that context, that sort of, even historical context is something that's going to be represented in the things that they write. And sure enough, sure, it's, it is crowdsourced and there are people who check and what have you, but you have to just ask yourself, where is that data coming from? I mean, so that's a more of a micro example, but then even if you zoom out a little bit more, like what is the data that's being consumed? Where does it come from in general? There tends to be a very strong Western bias in the data that is already populated on the internet and in different various systems. And many of the technologies that have been developed are first developed in an English speaking type of scenario, and so they're optimized for reading material that's in English, and of course they're adapted over time, but those things all contribute to bias. And so that's the first thing that I think about is, okay, where is this information coming from, and who is it coming from initially?
I have kind of a hot take question, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think technology will bring us further or closer to our spirituality?
I'm optimistic on it. I think we have to be careful, but I do think I'm optimistic that it can actually help people understand different viewpoints. And one of the things that came out of the research as well is this idea that our ignorance and is generally based on fear. It's generally based on our reluctance to ask people tough questions or that are or perhaps socially awkward. And what I found is that people have less of that issue when they're talking to a machine, right? They're willing to ask a stupid question or a socially awkward question of a machine to get an answer. And so I'm hopeful that that'll help. And that's sort of where that's at the core of some of the idea of this research is what happens or what should happen when you ask Alexa, is there a God? And what should she say? How should that answer be constructed? And I think I just think there's great opportunity for exposing people to more information and doing it in a way that sort of quells ignorance, quells some of the fear, and I think that'll bring people together.
Yeah, I do think there is something therapeutic in even just asking a question in a non-judgmental space. I like that you mentioned OpenAI. I've played around with it and talked to it, and I've asked it some silly questions, and I'm shocked that it responds. Cool, because it has to, but and the responses I get are sometimes coherent, sometimes not. But I find that it's pretty shocking to me. I do think there is an amount of self-discovery that can come with it, and I think of even AI in other settings where it's been applied. They talk about whether with chess players, Go players, or with in esports, they'll play against the AI algorithm, and then
Right.
The response is actually, from what I've read, overwhelmingly positive. A lot of them say that it helps them understand the game in a way that they'd never thought about before. And when asked if they played again, they said they'd want to practice with it. They want to keep engaging with it. And I wonder if maybe in the distant future, in the future, this could be something that I don't know. And instead of maybe some sort of counselor, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunity there. One of the core things that I think needs to change is the business model that is so often applied to technology and technology experiences. This advertising or this attention economy business model. That has shown to lead to some undesirable outcomes. Where you end up with these technical echo chambers and you kind of go down that path. I do think if there were a different model where it wasn't just about how do you sort of suck people in and keep them on the longest, but it's something that we would maybe be willing to pay for, as a subscription or something where we didn't have all of that pressure in the system to sort of monetize the time that you're spending, with it. And that has changed dramatically in the time that I've been in technology. Initially technology was you bought a product and then you used it, and it was the value was in the value exchange was when you first bought the product, and then the company, whoever created it, wanted you to have the best experience possible with that product, get the most value out of using it over the long term. And I feel like it's shifted now to, it's sort of almost cliche now, but like, people are the products in terms of the users are the products in terms of their attention. And I think that leads to a motivation that isn't always best aligned with delivering the most amount of value and the best experience for the customer. And so I think that would have to change. It means we're going to have to change the way that we use technology, the way that we consume technology, the way that we have an expectation for things being free or what have you. And so that's the thing that I think, we'll see kind of where OpenAI goes with their work. But the early signs are that they understand this very well, and so I'm optimistic.
What are your thoughts on apps like Headspace or Calm, where you pay? It's like a subscription model where you kind of pay for, I guess, a wellness experience, but I feel like with they're trying to provide a service that isn't, it's not trying to get your attention, it's just trying to provide you, a space to think. Do you think that's kind of closer in the direction you were talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think those are good examples. I think those companies are always, they're always going to want to see growth in their revenues, and so I think there's always probably a tension for them. In fact, the tension becomes greater the more successful you are, the more people you have. The larger market share you have, the harder it is to just generate more revenue based on getting more people. And so then you start thinking about like, okay, how do we monetize the individual users that we have? And that's the part where it gets a little bit more tricky. But yeah, those are examples where paying for a subscription, it's a very specific experience that you're desiring and that you're getting out of it. I think they're on to something there.
I want to still ask about your research experiment, because for some reason it's like really the image is very poignant in my mind. So I guess like if I were a participant, could you like walk me through what would happen? Because I'm right now, what I imagine is I'm sitting in a dark room and I'm asking Alexa these questions about life and God and what is good, what is evil, and like she's returning answers to me that I guess you've prepared, but then the algorithm kind of selects which ones to give. Like, is that correct? Or, can you kind of walk me through what happened in the actual experiment?
Yeah, that's pretty close to it. I mean, I had to adapt. I mean, initially I wanted to do this in person and have an experience, with a group of people and have them kind of go from different stations. And so there would be a station that would be an Alexa, there would be a station that would be a Google Home device, there'd be a station where I'd say, hey, pull out your mobile phone and text a particular number and ask these questions. And then like an internet kiosk where they could interact with search, and then people would kind of rotate around, and get each of those experiences. I adapted it to being online, and so I did most of it like how we are talking here, and where I had devices set up in proximity to my end, and participants would ask questions of the devices or text to different numbers. And as I said, we basically focused on this set of 10 questions, and there would be different permutations. People would ask questions slightly differently here and there, but the topic might be sort of death and afterlife, and they would ask a question, they would receive an answer from the technology, and then I would ask them to sort of, we had an emoji scale that they would rate the response on in terms of, I just said, however it makes you feel, happy face to like really frowny face, or upset or whatever, angry. We had a bunch of different responses. And then we would talk about it. Like what did you think about this? How do you answer this question for yourself? How did this make you feel? And then we would again at the end, we took about an hour to sort of recap the entire experience of this. And so, as I said, across the 10 questions, probably 7 to 8 of them would be sort of consistent with their religious background, and then 2 or 3 might be different. And then we would talk about sort of how did that feel as well. And so highly qualitative in nature, and definitely like I said, a simulation of where AI might be. Because today, if you were to go and ask Alexa, what happens when you die, she might say something like, well, you need to plug me back in, or I need, or I don't know, or, I never thought about that, and so clearly what's going on there is some programmer somewhere said, okay, for this category of questions, we're just going to punt. We're just going to we're going to make something up. We're going to tell a joke. We're just going to get off of that. We're not going to engage.
Yeah.
And so this was, it was interesting to see how people felt about these devices, something that they're very familiar with, giving an authoritative answer on, if it was the non-religious answer, it might say like, this is the one life we have. Like when it's over, it's over. Enjoy it, and so to see how people felt about that, it was pretty amazing, because we do tend to defer to these voices. We do tend to defer to information that's coming from them, and in some ways we can't look away. Like that's the other thing about they're not disregarded very often. It was that's a little bit of the flavor of it. I mean, sometimes, in any of these experiments, you have to be aware of sort of how long you can take somebody through it. You always want to have 3, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours, with somebody. But how do you make an experience so that they get something out of it and you get something out of it as the researcher? And I think I struck the right balance. And I think in some ways doing it remotely and over over video was pretty useful. People wanted to talk about something other than COVID and the election, and people wanted to engage on some of these topics and have a break from some of the other things going on in their lives. And so I was very fortunate in that time, and I think it was sort of the right size. And you can tell, Linda did an amazing job on that article, but she actually participated in the research, and so you get a sense of kind of how people felt from reading that article.
I promise this is the last question I have regarding the project, but I'm curious. Did people did you ever just read out the responses yourself, or did a human read it out? Because I'm curious. I wonder, disembodied Alexa voice versus just a normal human telling them the response, if their response to that would change.
I did not. It was all delivered, through the technology. So I didn't recite it for people. It's a good observation. It's a good question, because there's one of the bodies of work that I reviewed it's called the 4 voices of theological reflection, and it talks about the influence of normative voices, formal voices, espoused voices, and operant voices. And it, to your point, having a religious official, like an imam, a priest, a rabbi, a monk, having somebody read this text or recite an answer carries with it inherent, power, authority, and people respect it. And so I think that would be an interesting approach, and look at it. And there is actually quite a lot of research done in that space. And when you're working on a PhD, the big thing is to be unique and novel in the work. And so for me, it was, okay, does any of that authority, does it translate to a disembodied voice through technology? And it does.
Well,
And actually, one of the things that we talked about bias earlier as well, it's been well documented, well written about, just the bias even in the female voices that are the default for really pretty much any digital assistant. And
I hadn't thought of that. Oh, wow, you're right. They're all female.
Yeah, and you can change them, but nobody does really, or very few people do. And so one of the things in the research was that I did change to male voice occasionally. Maybe like a very sort of proper British voice.
Yes.
Sort of the disembodied idea of the sort of the God in the sky. Sort of Charlton Heston, like maybe. And there was a marked response, like when people heard authoritative male voice coming out of one of the devices saying, something relatively authoritative about good and evil, or life and death, or happiness. Like generally, people did not like that. Like they
didn't like it.
Yeah, it was a shock. I mean, we like to, most of the research shows that we like to have these devices appear subordinate, even though we give them lots of authority. And so it's a very interesting, and it is unfortunate, because even the idea of it being an assistant or a secretary, there's sort of this anthropomorphic whole costume that we put on them, like to say, okay, well, then it should be a demure female voice, and she, and it is even in that one aspect, you see bias coming out, but getting back to your question, it was only information from the devices, and then I relied on the literature review of what has been done in religious settings for sort of the viewpoint or the discussion point about human to human communication.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because, like we as we're in medical school, but, we have to like wear a white coat when we see our patients. And I do think, the setting of how you talk to someone and how you communicate, even when you talk to a priest, a priest is like kind of all dressed up. I think that really affects how you take the information, because if I were just wearing a t-shirt, seeing a patient like, oh, you have a hernia that we need to fix, like no one would believe me.
They would not take you seriously.
But like, sometimes I even put on the coat myself to, deliver more difficult things, because I just feel like there's more a willingness, a readiness to accept, and, part of it's cultural. But I do find it fascinating that people were more receptive towards a subordinate or, towards a female voice. Cause I don't know, I guess typically in spiritual traditions, it's always like some, very like regally dressed male figure.
Yeah, it tends to be a man, most religious traditions. I find that interesting.
Yeah, definitely. No, it has a huge impact. But yeah, maybe you too should start, the sort of, t-shirts and flip-flops, MD clinic, and see how it goes.
We'll have to wait until we're full-blown doctors. I don't think we can take it seriously as students.
I was also wondering, why do you think humans are so willing or ready to anthropomorphize these disembodied voices and like listen to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I think, this is how we process information. Like we're designed, we use our human to human experience to make sense of information when it comes to us through technology, and especially if the technology is presenting in some type of a human form. And so, the disembodied voice is particularly interesting because, it requires you to hang so many things onto it, like it to sort of make meaning of what's coming out of it, right? And so, you know, a lot of what would happen in the research is, you know, even though I would explain, as I did, you know, with you here, like, you know, this is how this experiment works. This is where the information came from. I can't tell you how many times people would say, oh, well, this was a Google device and Google is very logical, and, you know, Larry Page, you know, would think this way, or this is an Alexa device, and so Jeff Bezos must think this way. And I'd say, no, this is not coming from them. But I think it's because we try to make meaning, you know, and we use the tools that we have, which are all predominantly based on human to human communication. And then, you know, I do think, you know, this is, you know, going back pretty far, like, you know, like Sherry Turkle, we did a lot of work on sort of the metaphysical aspects of, you know, personal computers and technology in general. And we, again, we kind of think about, like the developer of the technology. We kind of think about that as a concept, or like a person that's telling us something. We give the machine a lot of credibility, just based on the idea that, like, hey, they don't really tend to make mistakes that often, and they have all this information. And so again, it's like this idea of you know, it's sort of this odd balance of like subordination and sort of deferral to like like something that might have more information for us. And so you know, this relationship is, it's also interesting that people tend to give machines a kind of more latitude on making mistakes, and like they try to like work with it, versus like human to human, where there's a conflict, they'll immediately go to like,
sure, it's the opposite.
let's fight about this and let's have an argument, you know, like with the machines, kind of like, well, I don't really feel that, you know. So it's you know, that's at the core of it, is I think that we have this sort of special place, you know, with technology, and a lot of it's based on understanding human to human communication, but then wanting it to be a tool that helps us, and wanting to work with it.
Certainly a lot of things to think
That's
about.
fascinating. Yeah.
You have such an interesting background in this topic. I love the world religions, the working for Microsoft, all of that. For us, we would love to hear some advice that you have, maybe just in general, for like someone in their 20s, advice about, it can be about AI, it can be about religion, or just life in general.
Or what would you give yourself? Advice
Advice to yourself.
Yeah.
I like that. Yes.
When you were in your 20s, what would you tell yourself now?
Well,
from
you know,
now,
it's a little bit, yeah, I'll give you the myself in my 20s, and then, you know, I've got now a 17-year-old, and so we're having lots of conversations about kind of his path forward and what I've seen there. So in my 20s, I mean, when the advice I'd give myself would be to relax. You know, take your vacation, travel more, read more, invest in friendships, and you know, and not be, you know, not have your career be the very center, like, and to say like, hey, your career is a long game. Like it'll, you know, do well, you know, be smart, work hard, all of those things, but don't make it the only thing, or make it, you know, one dimensional. And, you know, at that time, like in the workforce, it was very common for people to compete on how long you were at the office, and you know, and not taking your vacation. Oh yeah, and it was very much be seen and be there late into the night, and you know, and not, you know, you're working on holidays, all that stuff was sort of like, those were all kudos if you know, and that just bred this culture that was tough. And I think the reason I think things have changed a lot. I think at least in my experience in hiring and working with younger people, I think that there's much more of a balance here in this space now, and I think that's great, and people are demanding that kind of balance. And so, yeah, my advice, for me in my 20s would be in that direction. Today, I think it's a bit different. I think today what I observe is that there's for a lot of younger people, they've always had a lot of like structure around, you do well in school, you do well on your tests, then you apply to college and you get into a good college, and then you apply to grad school and you continue on, and these things are kind of all laid out for you, and you need to play 2 sports, and you need to do your volunteering work, and and it's just sort of this a pretty prescribed set of things to quote be successful, right? Or to set yourself up well. And I don't know, like I think stepping back and asking some of the questions like that were in my research, like what makes you happy? Like what's meaningful to you? How can you make a difference in that space? You don't have to be top of your class in mathematics or in sort of STEM related fields. Like what if you really are great at writing or in history, like there's something to that. And a friend of mine here at University of Washington, he teaches a class called Life Worth Living. It's Jim Wellman, and part of that class is he has young students write their life plan, which is sort of, hey, these are the things that are meaningful to me, this is what really matters. And the thing that he comes away with almost immediately is like a lot of the students say, this is the first time anyone's asked me to do something.
Wow, I feel like I need to do that. I think we should do that. It's a good activity.
And it could be something that you look at in a year or 2 or 10 or what have you, but at least you have like a checkpoint that is like, hey, like this is what I thought when I was 20 years old, that I thought made me happy and how I could contribute. And but I think doing that check-in and pausing for a minute, because I feel like there's so much being thrown at young people today in terms of demands from school, social media expectations, like everything is sort of like just incoming, and you can just spend your life essentially reacting to that, right? To try to take some time and write that plan, like write a short essay, which is sort of what would be my life worth living.
I got a question, especially regarding young people, young folk. So in the article that you're featured in the New York Times, one of the top comments pretty much was along the lines of Gen Z is well attuned to the I guess the needs of spirit, or the question of spirituality without needing religion. Because I guess like in the end, the author kind of, her main point was like, we need religion to help bring us closer, or religion and AI to help bring us closer, or spirituality, find meaning. But I guess the top comment, is a young person is saying, we can do this, Gen Z can do this without religion. And then my question to you is, what's your response? Like, do we still need religion moving forward?
Well, I think it goes back to sort of that definition of what, if you think of religion as a group and an organization, and you think of spirituality as something like an individual fabric that each of us weaves, right? So it's an interesting question, like if you, I guess the question is, are you going to do it on your own?
Yeah.
Are you going to figure out these, like, for me, it's like this list of 10 questions, but like there's a larger scope of sort of the phenomenon of spirituality. Like, are you going to spend some time thinking about that? Are you going to work it out? And then, if you have children, like, what are you going to tell them about this? Like how are you going to do it? I think a religion very often has a body of work, and I'll call it, a set of technologies that they've developed sometimes over thousands of years that have generally proven to be useful for people in some form or fashion. And so I think it's possible that you could find your way. It's a little bit like, it's maybe like a little bit like homeschooling. Like, can people homeschool and do well? Yeah, there are examples of that. Not everybody can do that. And some people might say, hey, I don't need to do that, or I don't feel the need to do that, or I think I've got it. But I think religion and religious organizations can be very helpful for people. I would tend to encourage people to look beyond just one, to get some different, just as you would do in many areas of thought and philosophy. You look across, you look kind of left and right and see kind of, what resonates with you and what's helpful for you. But if somebody wanted to, find their way on their own, I mean, I would never discourage that. But I think it's important to, though, understand culture, understand people, understand the world we live in. These things are, these are some of the building blocks of how societies work and function. And so I think whether you take in the religion into your own spiritual fabric, it's worthwhile knowing about it so that you can understand people more deeply. You can understand relationships. You can understand politics. I think all of these things are very useful. And so I think there's a difference between saying, hey, I don't want some group to tell me what to do, and saying, hey, I think that these groups have value to offer.
Yeah, and I feel like, your work has shown that, I guess, technology, AI, it can help us question, and it can help facilitate our own spiritual path. And I guess, like, maybe one of my last questions now is just, do you think, I don't know, like, technology, AI, would you put it in like the same category as just another one of these major world religions that kind of helps us question? Or would you put it as kind of like a big, like, meta tool / meta religion that is like almost like this next level religion kind of that people are more willing to defer to nowadays and listen to? I don't know if that question kind of makes sense, but
I think there definitely are people who view technology as, or it could be part of, an important part of a spirituality or a religion. I think for me, I put it in the tool category. I think, again, like, raising our level of consciousness, our level of perspective about when we're interacting with information that's coming from these systems, what inherent bias it might hold, and just having a better appreciation for that, I think is really important for people. I think that's not to say that it's all bad or it's not helpful, because I think there's tremendous possibility. But I think, ultimately these are tools that humans have created, and they should be positive, for us and useful. And we need to just be aware of how to use them.
That said, any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
No, I think we covered it. I think we covered a lot of those things here. I think, as I said, for medical students, and really students in any discipline where they're going to be using these artificial intelligence systems, I think having a basic understanding of how they work, where they have strengths, where they have weaknesses, how humans, the intersection of human thought with the information that's coming from these systems, could benefit the fields. So that's the area that I think all medical students and sort of all STEM students should really have, at the ready.
I have one last question.
Okay.
Last one. Yeah. What is your favorite spiritual text? Or yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting. I don't know that I have a favorite. I think these texts are interesting in that they're, at least for us, predominantly English speakers. They've all been translated, multiple times by the time they get to us. And so, it's, I haven't, I'm not a scholar of sacred text in terms of like being able to read them in, in their sort of more native forms. But I have a great respect for the intersection of what I would think of as, being like poetry and text. And, we see this in the Bhagavad Gita, to a certain extent, in the Quran. These are like, as Madeline was talking about earlier, in some ways they're an intersection of almost like a music and a spiritual text, with meaning. And so, I think the Bible does that just to a certain extent as well. But I do have an appreciation for, how the text and the sort of poetic aspects, come together in some of those works.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.